Hi everybody. Today we're going to be talking about classification. So we've already sort of started talking about classification a bit. I'm going to jump around these notes a little bit as we go through this real quick. I really recommend you read through the notes carefully yourself, but I'll try to attract your attention to some of the important points. So classification is the idea of taking all these different organisms that exist in the world and trying to organize them some way. It's really about organization. Can we take life, organize them, and then look at the pattern that was created with that organization and say, hey, this pattern means something. So, biological systematics, this is the study of the diversity and diversification. So, that means how life is different and how that life got to be different, and determining the relationships between those living things over time. So again, I'm really going to try to stress to you that everything in biology nowadays is studied from an evolutionary perspective, the idea that all life is connected. So we classify living things into groups, we name those groups, and that helps us to understand those things. Commonalities and differences amongst the groups are used to search for an evolutionary pattern. So it's evidence that all living things are related. More closely related two things are, the more recent their most common ancestor. So if all life is related and life has changed over time, then that suggests, it implies that there are ancestors that share characteristics with us. So any two organisms we name, there must be a ancestor that also shares those characteristics. So the three parts of understanding this systematics, this way of putting life into groupings and into classifications is taxonomy. That's the study of classification. So how are you going to classify? Classification, which is the process of organizing information about organisms and arranging them into some sort of hierarchical system. So bigger and smaller groupings. And then the study of phylogeny or phylogenetics, which is determining the evolutionary history and relationships amongst the various forms of life through time. Modern taxonomy, so modern classification, is based on phylogenetics. It's based on the study of evolutionary histories. So biologists study the relationship between organisms in order to place them in groups, and then study this classification of this groupings to find more information about the history of life on Earth. This is one of the ways that that we previously organized life. It should be said that this is a debated format now. Although this was for a long time the go-to way of organizing things, the need to use all of these different levels of organization has become less less obvious, less important in modern evolutionary biology, than the modern evolutionary lens on biology. So we are going to learn them all, but we don't really have to do much with them. Today, most biologists only really focus on genus and species, and then they start to talk about things in terms of clades, groupings that are sort of larger and not really anywhere. They are somewhat this whole part here in the middle, the class, the order, the family. Those categorizations are kind of falling out of favor. They aren't particularly useful. Uh, there is much more interest in sort of, you know, uh, organizing things by how they're related to each other, not necessarily looking at giving them a specific title for how they're related to each other, because life is continuous. Life is a stream of organisms that are changing over millennia. So, if you'd like, it would be a good idea to sort of try to get this order in your mind. This is the only time that I really will sort of test you on this idea, is the idea that the largest organization we can do is the domain. And this domains are based on the actual cell type. So there's only really 3 cell types in all of Earth's life. So we can call those 3 cell types 3 broad domains of life. Everything within those domains of life has been organized into kingdoms. Those kingdoms are smaller and they have narrower, and they cover for other factors than just the cell type. Phylums are even smaller than that, and phylas are inside of the kingdom. So if we think about sort of the sort of you know, Venn diagram here, we have all of life in here, and then all of life is sort of divided into 3. I think I should have made it smaller than that. These are the 3 domains. Domain 1, domain 2, domain 3. And then inside those domains, there are the kingdoms. Kingdom 1, Kingdom 2. I should have called it Kingdom 3. I don't want to get into the naming yet because we will do that at a different time. Whoops. Here is another kingdom coming at you. And so let's just stop. Let's go here. So this is one kingdom. There's actually more than one kingdom in this domain that I'm thinking of. But inside of this kingdom, we would find a phylum, or maybe 2. So this could be like, phylum 2, phylum 1. And then inside of that phylum, there would be smaller groupings yet, and then smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. And it would just keep getting smaller until we got down to the species themselves. So the population, the interbreeding population. 2 different organisms from different genuses can't reproduce. Organisms from different families can't reproduce. Organisms from different orders can't reproduce, right? Only the species can reproduce. And even then, we did talk about subspecies in the last lesson, so we know that there are some subspecies that don't reproduce even though they could. So here's a better version of that picture I just sketched out. So here you can see the domain. So the domain is labeled here. This is the eukaryote domain, or the eukarya. And then inside that domain, they're zooming into one section of the domain, which is the kingdom. And then they zoom into one section of the kingdom, they get to the chordatas. They zoom into one section of the chordatas, they get the mammalians. So these are the classes of the chordatas. They zoom into one order of the mammalia, they get carnivora, so carnivores. They zoom in on those carnivores, they find Felidae. So any organism that kind of has cat-like characteristics. They zoom in on those cat-like characters. There's a bunch of cats that all look like panthers, so they call them pantheras. They zoom in on one of those panthers, and they find the species Panthera pardus, or the leopard. So that's kind of the idea. So here in the domain category, we would have any organism that has eukaryotic cells. In the Animalia kingdom, we would have any organism that has animal-like characteristics. In the chordates, we would have anything with a backbone. In the mammalians, anything with a heart, with warm blood. Anything that eats meat mostly. Anything with cat-like meat-eating tendencies. So these Felidae, they must be hunters who are warm-blooded, who have a spine, who are animals who also have eukaryotic cells. And then we have the panthers inside of that. Panthers who are cat-like, who are carnivores, who have warm blood, who have a spine, who have animal-like cells, animal-like characteristics, and eukaryotic cells. And then the species, which is the panther, who is a panther-like creature, who has cat-like features, who has a tendency to eat meat, who has warm blood, who has a spine, who also is an animal, who is also eukaryotic in nature. So that is the point of this classification system, is to organize them into similar features. And this was under the idea that if we understood all the similar features, we would be able to to determine how life on Earth was related to each other. So there's lots of different scientists that we're supposed to study in this course to kind of get an idea of how organisms are related. So these are all Western scientists who are sort of important to the current Western framework for discussing animals, animal life. But this framework is evolving as we incorporate more points of view from the rest of the world um, and different peoples. So we will maybe see a change in the viewpoint of this type of classification in the future. So these systems for naming up organisms have changed quite a bit. In Aristotle's era, in 300 BC, there was a system that divided all things into plants and animals. I don't know how that system didn't exist until then, but I guess it was not one that was, a blanket system for doing this. Carolus Linnaeus, a scientist who renamed himself, gave himself a new name uh, to give himself a more Latin-sounding name, developed a system where he would name organisms, and he named a lot of organisms. He took it upon himself to give them all names, and this naming system included the system of the double naming system, so that the genus and species names, using the example of his own name, Carolus Linnaeus, to sort of be that example. So I think it's a bit of an odd type of scientist who goes and renames himself just to in his own naming system. But it was based on the way that two organisms resembled each other, largely based on his own sort of his own metric for that as well. So not a particularly not a great system for doing not a particularly subtle system or transferable is what I'm looking for. So he developed this binomial nomenclature where each name for a species was given in two parts. The first word was the genus, and the second word was the species. Both words would be italicized, and then the first word is capitalized, but the second is not. Both names are intended to be derived from Latin words that best describe the organism. Latin was used at this time as a sort of system of keeping science quote unquote pure because Latin was only taught to the educated or nobility. So it would so it was not and it was also Latin was used across Europe where even if you spoke French or Italian, you would also do your science in Latin so that it was transferable. So for example, Homo sapiens translates to thinking human. And we actually are a subspecies of Homo sapiens. So technically, we actually should add a sapiens here if we want to talk about ourselves, because Homo sapiens have been around for close to 2 million years, 2.5 million years, at least according to our to scientific research. And so Homo sapiens sapiens is the correct nomenclature for describing us, because we are a subscript. Although there's been 2 million years of Homo sapiens around the world, only some of those Homo sapiens subspecies have survived, and those are the ones that we identify with. And so we are the Homo sapiens sapiens subspecies that's out-survived all the other subspecies of Homo sapiens to be the only one left. In 1834, Haeckel suggested that organisms that were recently discovered through the microscope should be placed in their own kingdom. So they'd never seen these organisms before, so he proposed a name called Protista. Pro typically implies before, so protistas are sort of a pre-organism. And so all these single-celled organisms he was observing under his microscope, he thought, oh, these need a name. Later on in the 1900s, with the development of the electron microscope, we started to notice that there was differences in these single-celled organisms, and they started to call some of them prokaryotes because they were very distinct, and eukaryotes, which were the ones that looked most like us. So bacteria cells and then the plant, animal, fungi, and protist cells were all sort of distinctly separate. And this is where we start to see the definition of the domains. Domains are based on cell type. Whitaker in 1959 proposed that there should be five kingdoms to classify all organisms on Earth: Plantae, Animalia, fungi, Monera, and the Protistas. But in the 1970s, Woese went and analyzed a bunch of RNA. So this is a type of DNA. This is a type of genetic information. So this is genetic analysis. It's a type of genetic analysis. We don't have to know much more about that. And he divided out the organisms so that he divided out the sort of Moneras. So he divided Monera into eubacteria and archaeobacteria. So these were unicellular and prokaryotic, but slightly different from one another. So he wanted to sort of make that definition more clear. So this became the six kingdoms, and this is the most popular system, I would say, is where eubacteria and archaeobacteria are separate kingdoms. But Woese didn't give up, and so in 1990, Woese and his research group continued to discuss this and said that let's call these organisms, let's organize them into something we call domains now. So let's take the kingdoms and put them in larger groupings called domains to sort of indicate those cell types. So since all of these, notice that all of these have the same eukaryotic, that's referring to its type of cell. And we'll talk about that in a bit. In a couple lessons we'll be talking about cell types right away. So all of these had the same cells. So he said, let's call this domain eukarya. And then these ones, they are prokaryotic, but there was actually slight differences in their prokaryotic cells. So he said, let's call these ones over here. These ones are going to be called bacteria, and these ones are going to be called archaea. So continuing to use the name he had come up with before about archaeobacteria, he wanted to just pull that archaea part out, keep that part, and then pull the bacteria part out and call those and keep those separately. So that's where his three domains sort of came from. So this became the eukarya, which are all eukaryotes, which is your animals, plants, fungi, and protists, and then your bacteria, which are your true bacteria, so your E. coli and your cyanobacteria, whereas your archaeas are these extreme living organisms. So archaeas are a very archaic, that's where the name comes from. They're a very old type of organism in that their DNA does not seem to have changed very much over millions of years. I guess billions of years technically. So their DNA has changed the least maybe out of all of the organisms. So that's where the archaea comes from archaic. Archaic. I don't know if I can spell archaic, but if someone wants to correct that spelling for me, that'd be great. So it comes from archaic, from ancient organisms. Archaic. Okay, yes, I did spell it right. Okay, had to double check. So this is what it looks like now. Now, I did not even mention that in 2015, these system was split up yet again. So these systems, so here's the 77 from 1977 up till 2015. Here are some of the ways that the organisms and their characteristics have changed. So previously, in 77, we sort of mentioned the six kingdoms. Uh, we had eubacteria, we had the archaeobacteria, we had protista, we had plantae, fungi, animalia. And then in Cavalier and Smith in 1998, they proposed eight kingdoms. I don't know what they were doing, but they wanted to show that there are some of these protists that are kind of archaea-like. And there are some protists that were kind of plant-like, so they called them chromista. And so chromistas kind of have plant-like characteristics, plant-like. And then these archaeozoas had some archaea-like. But this didn't really hold out. So in 1998, this is like almost the same year, I guess. I don't know why it happens almost the same year. They back off and they say, okay, you're right. Archaea-like is not really a good thing. Let's go back to protozoas. And then the protozoa stuck through. Let's go protozoa, but I don't like we don't like the eubacteria archaea bacteria thing. Let's go to 6 kingdoms this way. And then Ruggiero in 2015, and I mean, this is not by any means the law. This is just one paper in 2015 that came up with this idea that we should do 7 kingdoms where we have the bacteria and the archaea again. So these are the same organisms all the way through. Uh, and then we should have the protozoans, and we also could put in these chromistas, which is a subgroup of the protozoans that will be plant-like. And so I like this system a lot. I think that the 7 kingdoms is nice to work with because I do kind of like that chromistas are kind of separate. Although there's still debate as to whether these should be together or apart. Apart. So I'm not sure which way to go on that one, but uh, they are similar but different. We'll talk about those in a bit. So the 7 kingdoms is coming up in this booklet in this unit. So we're going to go through these 7 kingdoms that are demonstrated here on the right. These are going to be our 7 kingdoms. Honestly, in my history teaching this course, I used to teach this part. I used to teach these 6 kingdoms because that's the ones I had notes on. And it was only after I did my own research my own research into the research that had been done that I decided that, oh no, you know what? I think these 7 kingdoms are more interesting and a better representation of what you'll be doing at the university level. These divisions are always artificial. So that's the other piece I want to remind us. That's what the only reason I really do this big deep dive into this area is because I want you to get this idea that we can label things all we want, but it's still just a bunch of human scientists labeling life that came about this world naturally. And so, and messily. Life is not clean. It's not a nice straight shot from one organism to the next. It's a big mess of crossing and uncrossing and changes and all sorts of things that happen. The labels are there to infer some sort of specific relationship between the species, and how these definitions were established tells us what that relationship is. Although these domains and kingdoms are kind of in the past, we don't really see them discussed as much now in modern biology. We do still use them sometimes for some simplifications and for using. So the 7 kingdoms system is divided into some very complicated subdivisions we're not going to get into, but as of 2015, the domains have even fallen out of fashion. So we really want to focus on a kingdom forward approach. We're not really going to talk about the domains so much, but we will discuss these 7 kingdoms in this course. Hopefully that's interesting to you. Now I will suggest that finding information on Chromista, as it is the more recent and the most debated one, this one can be the hardest to find information on. If you're looking for other videos, you'll often see these two together referred to as the protists. And so they will be the protists, the protozoans, the protista. I think that might even be the case if you look up what do they call them? The crash course video. So lots of people like crash course or crash course or Khan Academy. I believe they do focus in on these as protists or protista to cover both of those kingdoms together. So modern biology, just gonna final up word here. It tends to focus on the evolutionary relationships more than divisions by morphology. That's the appearance. So there's a constant debate over these definitions and the divisions that should be used. but that debate is specifically about domains and kingdoms, phyla, class, and orders. It's not really about it's not about species so much, but more about whether we should even bother with these phylas or classes or orders. What is what's the best way to organize them? Is it even worth organizing them when new information will show us that the two things are not related, or these two other things are more related every year? Many modern biology studies have even moved away from taxonomy altogether, instead focusing on the phylogenetics, organizing organisms by their similar characteristics, but not labeling it so much. Family, genus, and species are rarely redefined these days, though, because uh, although sometimes a species is moved from one genus to another, but that's sort of a rare event. All right, hopefully that gives you an idea of sort of the history of classification, the purpose of it, and the value of it. And we will talk more about this in our next video. Have a great day.